part of my writer project is to look at Walterdale in sort of a national context. And so in a comparative fashion, I'm also looking at alumni theatre in Toronto and some of my other work, and Ottawa Little Theatre, Victoria's Langham Court Theatre, the Theatre Guild, the Regina Little Theatre. So there's a number of these long-standing amateur theatres, and I sort of pull the older ones, the long-standing theatres, out of the I make a comparison anyways between those and some other amateur theatres that, they spring up out of more of an immediate need, and they don't always last that long. It might be 5 years, or it might just be a few productions. But my interest is really in the ones that have lasted for a long time. And one thing I have found across the board, to a greater or lesser extent, is that these long-standing theatres have been very flexible with their programming mandates from decade to decade. So Ottawa Little Theatre is the oldest English Canadian theatre right now. So it's well into its 90s. And Alumni Theatre in Toronto did its first production in 1917, 1918. So it's interesting to me how they've changed their focus and changed their mandate. And it's that sort of flexibility, I think, that has allowed them, these theatres tend not to rely on government funding, certainly not federal funding, occasionally provincial funding. Normally that's more tied into building expenses when a theatre owns or is renting their own location. There's a lot of upkeep, especially all these theatres have, or most of these amateur theatres have fairly old buildings that they're living in. One of the things is this flexibility where it's box office, which is really allows them to exist. These theaters at no point would have existed if there was nobody interested in coming to see the plays, and if there's nobody interested in doing the plays. So you can start up a theater company, and within a few years there's going to be some interest, but a lot of the time the interest lags, or there just isn't the motivation to keep those companies going. But Walterdale and Alumni and all of these other theaters have been able to sort of say, well, what are people interested in? And sometimes that's kind of the classic drawing room comedy, the sort of thing that people would expect from amateur theaters. But what I found increasingly is that a lot of these theaters have surprising, I think, to a lot of people, is that they've actually done controversial work. So Walterdale and Edmonton, Alumni in Toronto, both staged some of the first Theatre of the Absurd plays. So the first Pinter, the first Beckett were done in terms of the first in their own city, but also in the case of Alumni Theatre, the first production of Endgame, first production of Endgame in Canada was done at Alumni. And but these aren't the sorts of histories these aren't the sorts of facts you find in history books, because the history of theatre tends to be the history of professional theatre. Right? So it's interesting, how did that come about? And a lot of the time it's, somebody who's got their pulse on what was going on in Europe at the time and saying, well, we should introduce, these plays to a Canadian context. And professional theatres may, especially in the 60s, 50s and 60s, might not have been interested in taking a chance on what was basically then considered fairly obscure. As Theatre of the Absurd is considered fairly obscure fare to be putting on. It would have been just taking a chance. And but an amateur theatre in a full season might be able to program one of these shows with if it's a low cast of 2, 4, 6 people in it, to put it on with sort of sensibility of what's required to do those shows. So this to me is interesting, that there's kind of this programming flexibility, and then into the 70s maybe something else was interesting. Canadian material was very interesting to every theatre in Canada, or most theatres in Canada by the 70s and 80s. And new play development, and so Walterdale was able to sort of switch from this Theatre of Absurd sensibility maybe in the 60s into more of a new play or local play, sort of an atmosphere. Yeah, so I think this is across the board, and comparatively I think that most of these amateur theatres at one time or another have taken a real interest in premiering plays that wouldn't be done in a professional theatre in the same city.